Once disaster strikes, what do regulators do in response?
Kia ora, and welcome to the programme. In this second of a three-part series, we take a look at what regulators have to do to respond to emergency events.
In the previous episode, we mentioned that you may not think you are a crisis regulator, but these films might even surprise you with the news that you are. The network and cast of characters in the drama of a crisis that needs regulation runs wide, and it's just as critical to have it set up in many ways as having a business continuity plan.
Managing risk and building resilience is a collective activity involving all parts of society. So we find ourselves back in the nation's capital with our regulators, but it could of course be anywhere.
NEMA's key purpose is providing support to the community before, during and after an event, particularly in the area of wellbeing. And one of our key things is supporting the community in times of crisis. And that can be from natural hazards or events such as earthquakes or a volcano event or a tsunami. And we provide a vital link in all those phases in terms of preparing the community, supporting the community and providing resilience and recovery once the event's taken place. And I think NEMA's key focus is the people in terms of what we do and who we deal with. The bedrock of what NEMA's about is wellbeing and safety. That has to be the heart of everything we do, particularly when we're dealing with communities at times of crisis when they're vulnerable. Good coordination is key in the transition to recovery and the recovery phases.
The agencies that you would expect to see respond to a crisis, like the police, like NEMA, like the fire and ambulance services, they're pretty obvious. But there are a whole group of other agencies, both government, non-government and private sector, who respond during a crisis. One example of an organisation that comes into play during a crisis is the Temporary Accommodation Service found within MB. I'm very familiar with that team as I was the incident controller during the COVID crisis of 2020. What the team does during a crisis is they find accommodation support for people who are displaced from their homes and can't return to their homes. It's important that you have really good relationships across government and across the private sector because you're having to procure accommodation, transport, food and other services very quickly from a whole bunch of people, including private accommodation providers, hotel providers, motels, motorhomes, bus companies, and any number of welfare agencies who support people in a crisis.
Building relationships are really important to ensure that we have a collaborative and an effective response and that we build trust. So it's not just a matter of knowing some contact details, it's also about knowing who those agencies are, organisations are, having relationships with them that are active, open communication and knowing what their responsibilities and capabilities are.
In this episode, we look at response. How do regulators answer a crisis, protect and connect with the communities that they serve? Communities are at the heart of every response. And there's also continued wellbeing. Not just the communities, but also the regulators.
It's key to remember that there is a New Zealand government framework with roles and responsibilities that has been developed to ensure organisations can coordinate and cooperate effectively when responding to an incident. The framework is called the Coordinated Incident Management System, CIMS, and provides responding organisations with structures, processes, roles and responsibilities. Take a look at the CIMS manual on the NEMA website for more. There are 5 different levels of response in New Zealand, these being community, incident, local, regional, national.
So CIMS is the Coordinated Incident Management System, and it's the New Zealand framework for managing multi-agency emergencies in a coordinated and effective way. So CIMS is underpinned by 3 principles: responsive to community needs, flexibility, and unity of effort, which is about achieving common goals or outcomes.
CIMS provides a framework where a lower response level can be supported by a higher level. Most incidents only require activation at the incident level. However, a higher level will be activated if the scale, complexity, or consequences of an incident call for it.
Understanding comes at all levels when you've worked to get alignment and clarity of those roles and responsibilities. We find that doing a planning process jointly helps to establish those relationships and that shared awareness, and really the process can be better than the plan itself sometimes.
Designated agencies have the mandate or expertise for particular incidents that result in hazard.
For example, NEMA is the lead agency for geological and meteorological hazards, like earthquakes and floods, and MPI is the lead agency for biosecurity responses. While some hazards or risks are managed by the lead agency alone, many require the support of other organisations.
So incidences involve a wide range of agencies and organisations. The flexibility of SIMS means it is used by private and public sector, Māori organisations and community groups. It's important to have a common framework that enables interoperability and to have invested in prior relationships.
Role clarity and a shared understanding of the responsibilities of individuals and organisations is critical. This is particularly so in the crossovers and linkages between local, regional and national levels, and between business as usual and emergency roles. It's important to understand the roles and capabilities of agencies or organisations in your area, or ones you may end up working with.
The Coordinated Incident Management System, or SIMS, uses a command and control approach with a hierarchy with the controller or incident controller at the top. That person, he or she, has the responsibility for leading the response. They must also direct the different functions and teams within the response to achieve the objectives of the mission. That person, the controller, has a formal delegated authority either under statutory provisions or perhaps the internal arrangements of the organisation that they're working in. Working with and supporting the controller is executive oversight, referred to as the governance team, and this provides not just strategic direction but also support for the controller as they aim to achieve the objectives of the mission. Relationships during a response are just so important. Obviously, SIMS establishes a command and control framework, but within that we need individuals and agencies to be collaborating together, cooperating together to achieve a common outcome. So what do we mean by that? Let me give you an example. In 2019, I was the lead controller for the Civil Defence Emergency Management Group, Nelson Tasman, during what was called the Pigeon Valley fires. But none of this could have been made possible in terms of what we had to do without the support and close collaboration with the other key agencies involved, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, NZ Police and many others. We had to be on the same page, aligned towards the same common goal. We operate under a regulatory framework, so the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act, but also the supporting National CDEM Plan. Together, these documents lay out the important responsibilities of various agencies, including the National Emergency Management Agency. We understand what our responsibilities are for risk reduction, for readiness, for response, for recovery, and we can go to that regulatory framework to get the powers that we might need at the time of a response or into the recovery phase.
It's important to remember that any response to an incident is a process, and that may mean following a prescribed set of instructions. But there's also room for pragmatism.
Incidents requiring response have a lot of similarities between them, but also each one can be quite unique. When we're dealing with something as severe as an emergency response, we need to ensure that our regulatory framework is flexible and responsive to our needs. And we get that through some of the systems and processes we've developed. The Coordinated Incident Management System, or SIMS, is a good example of that. It's scalable, it's modular, it allows us to flex within that larger regulatory framework in a response mode. And I'm thinking back to the Pigeon Valley fires in 2019 as an example. So under SIMS, we were able to bring in an enhanced iwi liaison team to help us partner with and respond to the needs of our iwi community as we went through that emergency.
There's also the business as usual to be done. The regular business of government and regulation has to continue while the crisis is on hand. Who does the BAU? And how does the division of labour work in practice?
So for most organisations, the situations that can arise are going to fall into two broad areas. It's going to be something external has happened that the organisation is either a part of in the response or has been impacted by. That's earthquakes, fires, floods, those sorts of natural disasters. Then there's going to be internal events that might occur to an organisation that they have to deal with internally, like a data breach or a cyber attack. In both of those cases, what they're going to be trying to deal with is keeping the business going with potentially fewer staff, because you've got staff focusing on response, or you've got staff that are impacted by the event. And so for the business, it's about understanding, the people and the places and the systems that they need to ensure can continue to keep their business going.
The response phase transitions to recovery when we move in a formal way from response to recovery, supported by a transition to recovery plan. Now, this plan is developed by both the controller and the recovery manager. As the response winds down, we need to start looking at some housekeeping activities. Now, some of this involves things like document keeping. Are our documents properly filed for future reference? We also typically do a hot debrief. And this is to capture immediate observations from our participants before they disperse. Once they get entrenched in business as usual, they might not remember all the good observations that they actually made in the response. One of the main issues that need to be managed very carefully is to make sure that our response staff are rested properly before they return to business as usual. And this is not only for them to be able to clear their minds, but also to make sure that they're ready for a potentially heavy workload that might have piled up while they were busy responding.
There's a lot going on during the response, but it also has to be remembered there's a lot going on before the response. The emergency management system has to be ready to face any of the crises that confront New Zealand. This is the readiness part of the process, readiness of people, process and platform. You can find out more about this in episode 1. All emergencies are learning experiences. How can we learn more based on past experience? And how can the results of that be fed back to improve our response to an emergency when we encounter one again?
So after every event and exercise, so that might be a simulated activity where we are pretending there's a volcanic event or an earthquake, maybe a tsunami, what we want to do is have a look at our corrective actions that fall out of that. So we have a continuous improvement approach. We want to take a really deep dive into what were our actions that were really successful in a particular event, but also maybe what could we have done better. So taking a learning approach, what we do is we debrief our staff after every real event and exercise. We look at all of the systems and processes that we would have used in that particular event, and then we wrap that into a nice sort of package that says, right, here are some corrective actions, things that you could do better next time. And that might form quite a large piece of work, or it could be a really small incremental step in the process. Once we have identified those corrective actions, we want to put them into the National Exercise Program. So that is a collective body of agencies where we are simulating those events over and over again over a course of maybe a 10-year period. And that's to really see if we've embedded those lessons. Have we actually learnt what we thought we should have? Ultimately, there's a lot embedded in this continuous improvement process. Some of it's that deep reflection for ourselves, but it's also taking a wider system lens. So what can we do across the national security system with our other partner agencies to make sure that we're learning together? Much of what we want to learn from some of those really significant events like the Canterbury earthquake series has really informed our improvements over time for subsequent events like the Kaikoura earthquake in 2016. So the kind of things I'm talking about there are significant improvements in the way tsunami science is developed. We're also talking about the way communication and technology works. So as a result of some of the changes, what we've been able to do is speed up tsunami warnings, for example. It's all about keeping New Zealanders safe. That's at the heart of what we do, and that's really why we do continuous improvement.
As things move from response to recovery, the need to hold the team together is vital. But the players may change.
Response is quite different from recovery. In response, you have really clear objectives, generally focusing on saving lives and protecting property. Recovery is a different beast altogether. What success looks like is generally different for everybody that's been affected. And so our role in this is trying to determine and create good outcomes for everybody in a very ambiguous environment. Recovery is much more ambiguous than a response. You're dealing with a large amount of money that's coming into the system that needs to be managed effectively. You're dealing with this speed versus deliberation for decision making, a huge number of actors entering the ecosystem that are starting to do work that in one sense need either coordinating or just convening around the table, and the information flows of keeping everybody up to date. Those are just some of the challenges that present themselves during recovery.
The National Recovery Framework provides us with a shared understanding of who is responsible at what level of government for each aspect in recovery. Ultimately, communities are at the heart of any recovery.
In this sense, central government will always want some kind of assurance that the recovery operation is being run well. But we're kind of conscious that this reporting requirements can come across quite arduous, but there are some real benefits from it. That's namely that key decision makers have a sense of assurance that the recovery is being managed well, and then they might even be able to draw on other national leaders if required.
So the first levels of management of any recovery occur through the local authority and local government. They feed into the civil defence emergency management groups for each region. These groups are ultimately accountable to the Civil Defence Emergency Management Director. The National Emergency Management Agency then reports into the Minister of Emergency Management.
The earlier that recovery planning begins, the better. A planned, managed and coordinated transition from response to recovery management arrangements is key. How does a good recovery process help remedy that? We talk about that in our next and final episode. Until then, stay safe, stay well, and ka kite anō.